This tutorial deals with political socialization and culture, and a little bit about mass media as well. Socialization and political culture is very important for what we think is okay for a politician to say or do in public and to some extent in private. What becomes a scandal and what does not. And I'm going to use Canada as an example in this case because I live here and it's easy to find good examples. So what is political socialization? Basically, it's about how people adopt values concerning what is acceptable and not acceptable in society. What can become a political issue, what can become a scandal, and so on. And that creates our political culture. And there's a whole bunch of places where socialization occurs. Starts in school, even at home, the family. You go to civics class, you go to history class. Teachers will role model behavior. You might be singing the anthem at school. You're practicing how to govern in school councils and class governance. Your parents will have an influence and teach you moral and ethical values. You'll have friends. They will also impact what kind of values you develop. And of course, the mass media, pop culture, and so on and so forth. Others are religious centers, corporations, and their advertising that is sort of a very stylized and romanticized idealization of what's good and bad in society. Think tanks and the general debate in society. So all these things matter. And the result will be a political culture. We could define that as the ideas, assumptions, values, and beliefs that condition political attitudes and behavior. And it's a collective phenomenon. So individuals might think that a particular scandal is ridiculous, but apparently a lot of people think it means something. So in some societies, for instance, you should be very careful if you're a politician with how you spend your money, and if it's taxpayer money or your own money. And what you spend it on. In other countries, maybe you have to be very careful with your private life in terms of who your partner might be. And if you have an extramarital affair, that can lead to a great deal of scandal, and so on and so forth. So all these flash moments when there's outrage and when people are saying, this is not acceptable, you said something wrong, you did something wrong as a person, that says something about the political culture. And it affects political socialization, who we are as political creatures. And ideologies and dominant political perspectives will have some influence on this, but you can also say that political culture will affect how ideologies are expressed. So they're widely shared points of reference, but never completely uniform. So people are aware that this issue or that issue is sensitive. They might not agree with it, but they know it's there. And it forms kind of the common sense of the political arena and defines political legitimacy. And in this context, I should say that President Trump is a unique figure. As controversial as he is, a lot of the things that he has said and done would have condemned any other politician. Their career would have ended. And of course, there's been a lot of discussion about how much the American public will tolerate from President Trump, how much his supporters will tolerate from him. And that discussion in itself is really about political culture. And it seems like where there was previously an established common sense about what politicians were allowed to do and could say and how they could behave, now that has become opened up, and there's a lot more uncertainty. If Trump can do it, can others do it too, or is he the only one who can get away with the things that he's been doing? Will there be a backlash after Trump? So how he talks in a very particular way, how he tweets, all these things are continuously questioned. That's the political legitimacy that's continuously questioned. And the ramifications of his political career and what that will have as an effect on American political culture is yet to be seen. But it tells you something about how political culture evolves over time and how it's contested over time and negotiated over time. To look at Canadian political culture, just to get away from the American arena for a little while, you can say that it's a North American style of political culture that has some commonalities with American political culture, but is also very reflective of European political traditions and is evolutionary, not American revolutionary style, but an evolutionary sense of political culture. There is more negotiation, compromise, and so on and so forth, because Canada as a political entity did not grow out of violent upheaval. It grew through reformism. So there is a whole series of negotiations and tensions within the Canadian political culture that has shaped how it looks like now. So the Anglo-French relation, Quebec versus the rest of Canada, multiculturalism, which is now considered one of the founding traits of Canadianness, if you will, Indigenous self-governance, the issue of the position of Indigenous peoples within the constitutional framework of Canada, which still hasn't been properly resolved. That issue was brought out in the discussion of the Trans Mountain pipelines and so on. Peace, order, and good government, which is a phrase from the Canadian Constitution, which is also often invoked as an example of Canadian political culture. So if the Americans have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the Canadians have peace, order, and good government, which is said to be an expression of the difference in political outlook, affinity, behavior, demeanor in Canada compared to the Americans. The media, of course, is very important in political culture, being the fourth estate, if you will, a major player in politics. Now, it might not have the same position as it did, say, 30 years ago, because social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all these different outlets have shifted the powers of gatekeeping in public space. No longer can the major print medias and broadcasting corporations claim to be the sole arbiter of who gets access to saying something in public so that everyone can hear it. But it's still an important actor. It's still a major player, and that's why it's called the fourth estate. So its check on the power of government, its role is to hold government accountable, and sets the agenda by prioritizing issues, by saying this is important news, that is not important news. Now, an important question here is about sources, of course. What are the central questions and conflicts of an issue? Who gets to decide what question to ask? And this news triage, which has also been criticized in terms of what choices the more powerful media companies make in terms of what they should put on the front page, how they should write their headlines, and so on. There's a continuous conversation going on basically how they are doing the job, basically who's watching the watchers. And that's also one of the problems that the media have to wrestle with. They are working in a particular cycle. They have to attract attention from their audiences in competition with many other outlets. They have to make the information they present easily accessible. And how do they go about doing that? So with so much choice, do we get a variety of opinion, or what are we looking for? And how do we choose a reliable source of information? And who controls the different media outlets? A lot of major outlets are owned by major corporations, sometimes the same major corporations. In some countries, government can provide subsidies to media and even owns media. So the CBC is publicly owned, BBC is publicly owned, that's in Canada and the UK. Is that affecting the reporting? What is the editorial line? There's a lot of media outlets that have taken an ideological position on the left-right spectrum, Fox News and so on and so forth. And that's going to affect the questions that the journalists affiliated with that outlet will ask. So that's a brief outline of political socialization, political culture, and the role of the media.